Well, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to come out today. I know it's not trivial to travel around here, so I get to come up to New York usually once or twice a year, and I'm extremely pleased to be here. We support a lot of the industry associations that are represented here today. I was just in Chicago at the ISSA International Conference speaking there Monday, Tuesday this week. A couple weeks before that, I was at the ISC Squared Congress in Anaheim speaking there. And we try to sponsor all of these industry associations, both at the international level and also at the chapter level. And so I've done that on my team for almost 10 years now. So this is a very, very important audience to us. Your expertise that you bring to the table at the chapter level, at the international level, is extremely important to the entire industry. So I want to thank you for your efforts around these industry associations. So I've been coming to New York, as I said, for many, many years. Years ago, back in the 90s, when I started at Microsoft, one of the first things I had to do was come to New York and brief some customers. Microsoft's offices back then were over in Hell's Kitchen. I came in and I was ready to go. I started briefing these customers. In about 5 minutes, they were bored with me and started precision questioning me, and they were very aggressive. And I came home, went back to Redmond. My wife said, "How was your trip to New York?" And I was like, "Well, they're pretty aggressive. I mean, they got very bored very quick, and they had lots of hard questions." And so many years go by, and now it's my next big trip to New York many years later. And my wife's like, "Are you ready for the big New York welcome you're going to get there? You know they're going to ask you lots of questions. They're going to be very aggressive. Are you ready for this?" I'm like, "Well, let's see what happens." Go to New York. I'm in New York for a week talking to lots of customers. Go back to Redmond with my wife. She's like, "So, did you get the big New York welcome?" And I said, after working at Microsoft for all these years with all these engineers, New Yorkers are warm and friendly. That's what I've been dealing with. They tell you what's on their mind. They look you straight in the eye. I love it. I love New York. I have to say, I really do. So I got a lot of stuff to cover today. I've got a ton of content here. So today, all of you are aware that we're going through a whole range of disruptions for technology. Everything from mobile, which has been happening for quite a while, social, again, been happening for quite a while. For instance, my son, he's 14. I said, we got to look at getting a learner's permit for you so you can learn how to drive. He's like, "Well, why would I do that?" I said, "Well, so when you're 16, you can go out, have a little bit of independence, go out with some friends, you can drive." It's like, "Dad, my friends live in Germany and the UK. I'm not going to drive to see them." I'm like, "Really? I never thought about that." So social networking has changed culture. It's just not a technology. It's literally changed the way that people are growing up across the world. Values are changing. All right, cloud, we're going to talk a little bit about cloud today. This is definitely something that is a real paradigm change in computing that we're seeing. And then big data is huge. There's lots of customers that I talk to around the world. I spend a lot of time with CISOs and CIOs. Big data, they're hiring more and more data scientists. Everyone's trying to get their hands on people that understand data and how to monetize the data that they have, figure out how to drive their businesses forward based on the data that they have on hand. The other thing that we're seeing today in a big way is the Internet of Things. It is here. It is not someplace in the future. It's happening right now. So you're seeing many, many devices being manufactured by many, many manufacturers. So when you think of high tech, don't think of like Microsoft and Apple and Google and Samsung, a bunch of handheld providers battling it out for who's going to own the mobile world. We're talking about thousands of manufacturers coming out with tens of thousands of devices that are all internet connected. And if you want to be relevant in high tech in the future, this is the new battleground, Internet of Things. So this is here today, all of the sensors, measuring everything from vibration to heat to pressure. Everyone trying to get data so that they can figure out how to control costs, how to be more efficient, the big data analytics that I talked about. So there's a lot of companies trying to get their hands around Internet of Things and drive forward. And the center of all of this is cloud, and I'll get into that here in a little while. Now the backdrop to this is security. That's what we're here to talk about. And we're in the world today, when we take a look at what's actually happening, it's hard to understand whether things are getting better or getting worse. So what you're seeing here is These are CVE numbers, common vulnerability exposure numbers that are tracked by NIST and Department of Homeland Security. We're just adding them up for a 6-month period. So 1H06 is the first half of 06, 2H06, second half of 2006, all the way into the second half of 2014. And we're adding them up. And what you see here, these are vulnerability disclosures across the entire software industry. For the longest time, the grand heyday of vulnerability disclosures in the industry was 2008, where we saw about 3,500 every 6 months, so almost 7,000 vuln disclosures across the whole industry. And as we go into 2014, we saw a massive increase, 56% increase in vulnerability disclosures in a 6-month period. And it's pretty interesting to see this happen after many, many periods of declines, how things are starting to ramp back up in terms of vuln disclosures. Now, if there's good news here, the good news is that this is going to be an anomaly, because the 56% increase is simply due to SSL validation vulnerabilities in the Google Play Store, where a bunch of apps trying to do SSL validation had a vulnerability that enabled a man in the middle of attack. And that'll go away as they fix those APIs, as they fix those apps, that'll go back down. But it shows you very quickly just how quickly vuln disclosures can go way, way up. Now, a lot of CISOs use these numbers as a proxy to figure out whether things are getting better or worse in the industry. And this is kind of a poor proxy. There's better things to look at than this. The other thing we see is, one size does not fit all. You've got lots of different things going on around the world. It's not all the same. Malware infection rates, the type of malware that we see, drive-by downloads, malware hosting, phishing hosting, is all different. There's different levels of this all over the world. So if you have a security strategy based on what you're doing in a single location and you're a multinational company, you've got to rethink that, because one size will not fit all today. There's lots of things going on here. For instance, ransomware. I've been talking to people about ransomware for a good 7 years. It started in North America. Okay? And in order for someone to get tricked to install something on their system that will ultimately encrypt their hard drive, they have to understand the threat to begin with. Meaning it has to be localized in a language that they understand. So it started in English in the US and Canada, and it's been going east ever since. So I was warning people 5 years ago in Asia, it's coming their way, because we could see them localizing the threats from English into French, from French into German. You could see it going around the world with them localizing it. So it just gives you an example of one way that these threats will evolve over time. And most of the threats we see today, or most of the successful ones, have some social engineering aspect to them. So culture and language definitely play a role in what's going on here, and it's even more complicated than that, and I'll get into that in a bit. Now, one other thing that we're seeing here is how these threats are evolving. You don't really have to have a high level of expertise in order to get onto hundreds of thousands or even millions of compromised systems, because we have exploit kits now. So what you're seeing here is, this is the top 10 list of exploits that we get data from hundreds of millions of systems around the world, and their prevalence on a quarterly basis. But the thing that's amazing about this list is that exploit kits now, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the top 10 are kits. That means that they're professionally managed software suites, where whoever's managing them is leasing them or renting them. They're putting in new exploits over time. As old exploits stop working, they put in new exploits and they start working, right? So they're constantly trying to work for their customers and get their customers onto as many compromised systems as possible. So 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, you would not see exploit kits on this list at all. And today you can see 50% of the exploits on here are kits that contain 10, 20, 30 different exploits for different operating systems, different browsers, and they're constantly being updated because they're professionally managed. And so these, for the last probably 3 years, have been growing in popularity. I can just go and rent one. I don't need to know how to program. I don't need to be a criminal and understand how to compromise systems. I can just go rent one and then ensnare hundreds of thousands of systems. And most of these work through unpatched vulnerabilities and social engineering. and of course weak passwords. The other thing we're seeing, I get asked this question a lot, you know, every time I read about the big exploit of the week, it seems like more and more breaches are happening all the time, and every time I read the explanation of how the breach happened, you know, part of the story is always this is the most advanced breach we've ever seen, the most advanced threats were used against the organization and so on. And frankly, from my team at Microsoft, we published the Microsoft Security Intelligence Report for 10 years now. After looking at this data for 10 years, I can tell you that the threats are a variation on a theme, right? They're not getting more advanced. They're using the same tactics: weak passwords, unpatched vulnerabilities, configuration errors, and social engineering. Those are the 4 ways that people get owned 100% of the time. Okay? But what I do see happening, thank you, what I do see happening is things are moving a lot faster. Things are compressing. The timeline that the attackers are using is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and that's what you see in this graph. So what we're looking at here is it used to take weeks, even months, for a new exploit, for a disclosed vulnerability, to make it into one of the exploit kits that I'm talking about. Remember, an exploit kit is really, once you get into an exploit kit, you're going for a mass compromise. You're trying to compromise as many systems as possible, get onto those systems, remote control them, build a botnet, then rent that botnet for spam projects, phishing projects, hosting illicit content, and so on. That's the goal. Identity theft is a big part of that, and so on. But what you're seeing here is how quickly things are changing. Just in the year 2014, you can see, typically when we release a security update, we call it Patch Tuesday, right? Then there's Exploit Wednesday, right? We release the update, the bad guys get the update, they reverse engineer it because they have automated tools that do that for them within minutes. They find the vulnerability, then they start to try to write exploit code for that vulnerability. And if they're successful, they will have an exploit. That usually took, as you can see in early 2014, it had sped up to the point from maybe weeks or months to within 30 days they were having new exploits inside those exploit kits. Then as the year went on, it sped up even more within 10 days. And now what we're seeing is, for the first time, is 0-day exploits. Before we even release the patch, the exploits are in exploit kits that are being rented and sold. That is an amazing pace to see that happen, because that's real risk. That's not getting systems that are being patched slow. That's getting systems that don't have a patch. It's not even available in the market yet. So things aren't getting more advanced, they are speeding up. And if you're not patching, which is the #1 way to prevent this type of exploit, you're not patching all of your software, because most of those vulnerabilities we talked about, 85% of them are in applications, right? Things other than operating systems, things other than browsers. And they always have. Since they started the CVE database in 1999, you're looking typically at 80% of those vulns are in applications. But yet people will patch Internet Explorer or whatever their browser is, and they'll patch Windows or they'll patch their operating system and call it good. And you've just missed 80% of the publicly disclosed vulnerabilities in any period. So you have to patch. That's why they're doing this, is because they know people are not keeping up to date. The other thing that's changed is the motivations of the attackers. There are more attackers today with different motivations than ever before. So once upon a time, we all read about the script kiddies that thought it was fun to prove that they were smarter than everybody else. Then it evolved into crime. People figured out they could make money doing this. And then since then, we've realized that the governments have been doing this. And in fact, governments have been doing it longer than anyone. Because most of the tactics that we see in use today by criminals and hacktivists and all of the other people with different motivations out there came from government, right? The types of attacks and the tools and the tactics that we see in use today by criminals were actually developed by the government many years ago to do military espionage. The military espionage have been the source of a lot of the information and tactics that you see in use today by common criminals. This is nothing new, because military espionage has been done around the world since governments existed. But what we're seeing is that type of activity has lowered the bar, right? As soon as, for instance, Stuxnet was discovered, the worm that that allegedly targeted a nuclear facility in Iran that was allegedly created by US and Israeli governments. As soon as that was discovered by the bad guys, they looked at the vulnerabilities that worm was using, which were zero-day vulnerabilities, and they baked one of those vulnerabilities into commodity malware. And today, here we are 5, 6 years later, and that's still the #1 attempted exploit in the world. And it was discovered allegedly by a government, which lowered the bar to entry for a whole bunch of criminals that are trying to use it on a mass scale today. And the hard part about this is you don't know who's attacking you. Is it a nation state? Is it a criminal? Is it a kid in a basement? The challenge here is they all look the same on the wire. When they come across the network, you can't tell what the motivation is of the attacker. If you can't do attribution and you don't know what their motivation is, how do you respond? What is a proportional response to that attack? Who's going to help you with that response? Is it military? Is it government? Is it law enforcement? Is it an industry association? Who should help you with this? Who's going to pay for it? Okay, you don't know because you can't tell who's attacking you. You don't know what their motivations are. So this is the world that the CISOs that I talk to live in. The businesses are asking them to help them drive business forward with cloud, big data, IoT, social networking. And traditionally, they've been focused on things on premise, so things like identity management, and identity is absolutely critical to security. Configuration management, threat management, response is part of their security strategy. And for the first few years when these big megatrends started coming out, CISOs would say no, no, no. And what would happen is those businesses would go around the CISO because they're not going to take no for an answer, right? They're trying to be competitive in a hyper-competitive market that's being disrupted by a lot of different technologies. So those CISOs over time have learned if they kept their jobs, they have to enable the business to take advantage of disruptive technologies. But regardless of what they're doing, they're still responsible for the security of the data at the end of the day. Just because the business is asking them to do something hard doesn't mean that they don't have the accountability for securing the data. Now, I mentioned the cloud is the center of it all because today the cloud really represents the only place where you can actually store and process this much data, right? IoT, if we're looking at billions or trillions of devices that are going to be deployed over the next 10 years, you're not going to store and process that data on premise, right? You're getting constant amounts of data from a whole array of different types of devices. You're not going to process that on premise. It's just too expensive. So most of this today is being done in the cloud. And the cloud represents a big opportunity for businesses, but there's lots of people that have questions about government access to data. There's lots of people that have questions about security controls in the cloud. I had a conversation with a gentleman over here over coffee today telling me the cloud is insecure. So I get this a lot. Everywhere I go, we talk about the cloud, because it's the center of all this. This is where the data is going to be stored and processed for the most part. So let's talk a little bit about strategy. Let's talk about kind of what, in a nutshell, what Microsoft's security strategy is. Our security strategy is to drive down the return on investment for attackers. We want to make the kinds of vulnerabilities that we talked about here, we want to make those vulnerabilities very hard to find. We want to make it so when they find a vulnerability, it's very hard to figure out how to write exploit code for it. We want to make it so that if they try to write exploit code for it, that their exploit code will work very inconsistently and it'll be very unreliable. We're trying to make it hard for them so that they have to spend more time, more money, more resources to do exploitation so that they just move on and do something else that's cheaper. We're going to make it so hard for them to do this type of work that they're not going to bother to do it. That's our security strategy. Now, how are we trying to do that? We use something called the Security Development Lifecycle, or the SDL. The SDL has kind of three simple goals. Reduce the number of vulnerabilities, reduce the severity of those vulnerabilities. So we want to move vulns from being critical, which means they are remote code executable, potentially, down to just medium or just important. And then maybe most importantly, we want to make exploitation of those vulnerabilities extremely difficult, if not impossible. Those are the goals of the SDL. The SDL is a process. It is a development process And it's also a set of tools that help the developers through that process. Because what we learned many years ago is that you can't turn 36,000 developers at Microsoft into security experts. That doesn't work. So if you run into vendors and you ask them, what's your secure development strategy, and they tell you, well, we have the best developers in the world, that means their strategy is hope. They hope that none of those people make a mistake. Because many people do not have a security aptitude, nor do they want to be security experts. You have to have a repeatable process, and you have to have tools to support them in that process. So this gives you kind of a snapshot of what the SDL looks like. It's also the basis for an international standard called ISO 27034. So we worked with ISO on this standard to make it easy for you to go to your vendors that you buy software from, or even if you're making it internally, you can just go to the vendor and say, hey, are you the ISO 27034? Can you attest that you meet the standard? And if they say no, say, okay, we'll come back to us when you do. Because you're not doing what you need to do in order to make sure that the vulnerabilities that are in your software are very, very hard to exploit. In fact, what we do is when we audit a lot of software, we'll use the same tool set that the SDL provides to us, and we give that away for free. We'll see, do they turn off all the mitigations that we manufacture the compiler that they're using, right? So we have all the mitigations, ASLR, DEP, CHOP, all turned on by default. In fact, in the new compilers, there's a switch called the SDL switch. It's just a check mark that's on by default. All of these things are turned on by default. And what they do is they uncheck the box and turn them off. Because they don't want to deal with the compiler errors, the compiler warnings. It's just simpler to uncheck that box, reduce the errors, reduce the development time, and make that software cheaper to develop. So I'll give you an example of what SDL provides. For instance, here in the design phase, every single phase of development has its own security requirements. In the design phase, we have, for instance, threat modeling. That means before the developers start writing code, they look at where the inputs and outputs of data are, where data is stored, how it's processed, the system that they're trying to build. And they threat model that. They look at where can it be attacked? How can this system be attacked? And that way, that will inform, that model that they create will inform the software that they ultimately develop. And we actually give away a threat modeling tool. This is the same tool that they use. In fact, last week we released a new version called Threat Modeling Tool 2016. You can go to microsoft.com/SDL and get that tool. And it's just like a Visio diagram. They walk through and they threat model their software before they start writing the code, so that this model informs the design of the product. Makes it more resilient and harder to attack. All right, so how do you stay ahead of these exploits that we've been talking about? Well, first thing is, know that they're using a compressed time frame. Okay, now that you've seen how quickly they're moving, the status quo isn't going to work anymore. I know there's a lot of financial services customers here, and I talk to financial services customers all over the world, that you have a process, you have a methodology that you use to figure out how quickly to deploy patches. Okay? So now go back to the office and use the fact that they're deploying more and more 0 days, and even when it's not a 0 day, they have it inside those exploit kits within 10 days. Plug that into your process. Does the quarterly patch deployment process that you have in place get a meet pace with them? Okay, because they're not living on the same set of rules that you are, the same process, the same cost structures. They don't care. They're going to keep coming, coming, coming. And if your job is to protect your organization, take a look at the data and you'll see that you need to move faster. You need to be more focused, not less. And it's not because I'm telling you as a Microsoft guy, it's because they're telling you. Okay? The other thing is, I mentioned patching. Newest versions of applications, Adobe apps, for instance, or Microsoft apps, or Apple apps, it's all the same. The newer software we've seen over time is more resilient to attack than older software because, first, they're using better compilers than they did years ago. Second, more and more organizations are paying attention to security. But we see that there's typically a honeymoon period with new apps or new operating systems. Usually takes about 6 months before you start to see attackers make progress on a new platform. So very often running new versions of software is an advantage for you, at least for a period of time. And then we have the thing, we've made it easy at Microsoft to get a hold of a lot of the security software that we create, the products and services in this thing called the Enterprise Mobility Suite, which contains probably at least 12 different security products. There's this thing called Advanced Threat Analytics that many people don't know came to market just a few weeks ago. One of the top attacks that we see in the enterprise is the so-called pass-to-hash attack. So the attacker gets onto the network because they phished someone. So someone got tricked, again, social engineering, into releasing their username and password. Now the attackers, within seconds, because this is automated, are using that username and password on that network. And it's not an attack that you'll detect with IDS, IPS, AV, or any of the other security products because it's valid user credentials being used on systems that they have access to within the environment. They travel around the environment looking for cache credentials. And when they find admin cache credentials, now they own the environment. They get to the Active Directory, they download all the usernames and passwords for offline attacks, yada, yada, yada. This Advanced Threat Analytics actually will show you all of those pass-to-hash attacks that are happening on your network, show you which systems are leaking credentials, which systems are, which DCs, domain controllers are involved, and so on. So it's worth a look. And if you go on to Microsoft.com, you'll be able to find Advanced Threat Analytics, which is part of this Enterprise Mobility Suite. Now, I mentioned I speak at a lot of different conferences, and I hear security experts all the time come up and tell people that antivirus software is dead, it's a worthless technology, it's a waste of time, signature-based technologies are dead, yada, yada, yada. Okay. Our antivirus lab, and by the way, Microsoft's the largest antivirus vendor today in the market, period. We have more installed base of Microsoft antivirus than any other company, antivirus company in the world. Okay, it's baked into Windows 8 by default. It's baked into Windows 10 by default. We give away Microsoft Security Essentials in over 30 languages around the world. Our antivirus lab at this point is processing 2 million threats a day. If you don't run antivirus software, you're not protected from any of those 2 million threats that come around every single day. Now, the reason why these guys say that antivirus software doesn't work is because it doesn't protect you from all attacks. Okay? But it is going to protect you from those 2 million threats that we see every day. Why are there so many threats? Is because the bad guys are using mass automation to attack you. Never think that the playing field is level, because it's not. What they do is they go in and buy all the antivirus products from all of the antivirus companies and put it into a lab. They write their malware, they run it through every scanner to make sure that none of them detect that malware. Then they monitor it as they deploy their malware. If one of the antivirus companies gets a sample, adds it to their signatures, the signatures gets updated in their labs, now it's detected. So they have server-side polymorphism, which means that they're serving up a different version of that malware constantly so that they can outpace the antivirus companies from getting samples of that malware and adding to their signatures. And the scale that they're doing at this today is once one of these systems gets infected, they will update that system with new malware 600, 700, 1,200 times a day, meaning that it's very difficult for the antivirus companies to keep up with that pace. Very difficult. Okay? But if you don't run antivirus software, you're not going to be protected from all of the threats that they do know about. Okay? So what you're seeing here is data from 700 million systems that we get data from a month, showing you how many systems are unprotected, intermittently protected, and always protected. And intermittently means, I think antivirus slows down my game, so I'm going to turn it off. So we know that you have it installed, it's up to date, but you just haven't turned it off or paused, right? What we're looking at here is the infection rate for each set of these systems, the ones that don't have any up-to-date antivirus, real-time antivirus installed, and the ones that have it installed and running all the time and up to date. You can see the malware infection rates for unprotected is substantially higher, like 23 systems per 1,000 that we scan. Intermittently is almost as high, so if you have it installed but you just have it turned off or paused, don't bother, just uninstall it and save yourself the time, because you're going to have the same malware infection rate as if you didn't have it at all. And then finally, to always protected, you can see that it's a very, very small infection rate in any given time, usually about 2 or 3 systems infected for every 1,000. And this is actually, again, another regional thing. you can see around the world the places in the world that have the most protected systems, the least protected systems. The worldwide average in any period is usually about 75 to 80% of the systems in the world have up-to-date real-time antivirus software installed. That's a huge number. I was very surprised when we started doing this study a few years back that it was that good. But it's regional. Some places have higher real-time antivirus usage than others. The Middle East is always an interesting place because the malware infection rates there are extremely high compared to most other countries, and that's something that I've blogged about quite a bit. So this shows you, this data here will show you why antivirus software works despite what the experts tell you, okay? So what you're looking at is, for instance, if you take a look at Libya and Iraq, the number of systems that are unprotected, around 40% of the systems in the country don't have real-time antivirus software installed on them. The CCM is the infection rate, the computers cleaned per mil being a Latin word for 1,000. So 60 systems in the third quarter of 2014 were infected for every 1,000 systems that we scanned. Okay? And then the unprotected systems in the same quarter is almost double that. So you can see in the most active place in the world when it comes to malware, that if you install antivirus software and keep it up to date, that even in that environment where you're heavily under attack, that antivirus software does have an effect. It has a positive effect. Now the other thing, as I mentioned, it's regional. Some people at this point think, well, how is this regional? How are antivirus or virus infection rates regional? Because the virus infection rate in the United States is typically just below the worldwide average. Worldwide average is usually around 9 systems infected with malware for every 1,000 that we scan. The United States is usually right around there. We saw places in the Middle East significantly higher than that. And every country has a different story, not only a different malware infection rate, but also a different type of threat and a different list of families of threats that we find in different concentrations and prevalencies in those areas. And this actually is more complicated than whether you run antivirus software or not. There's a bunch of socioeconomic factors here at play. We've looked at GDP, inflation, unemployment, Facebook usage, broadband penetration. There are some things that correlate with malware infection rates that you can actually predict what the malware infection rate will be in a location based on the socioeconomic indicators that we see there. And it's not the same. What we found in developed countries, the more things mature in the developed countries, so I'll give you an example. The more broadband penetration in a developed country, the less the malware infection rate is. The negative 0.33 that you see there, the more broadband penetration, the less malware infection rates we see in developed nations. But if you look at in a developing nation, the more broadband penetration, now it's a positive correlation. The more broadband penetration, the higher the malware infection rate goes. There is a tipping point here where they go from the developed country to developing country, where public-private partnerships and public policies start to kick in and catch up to building the infrastructure. And then you see them kind of go over that tipping point from malware infection rates continuing to go up as more and more people come online to now starting to go down. So countries like Brazil have gone over that tipping point in just the last couple of years. So how can the cloud help? Back to this conversation I had with this gentleman over here today. First thing to understand is the cloud is a bunch of different things. It's not one thing. It's a bunch of different things. So in this case, I'm comparing on-premise to infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. And you can see that you're a partner with your cloud service provider. You don't just write the check and say you're in charge of data security now. Depending on what model of service you're buying, you're going to delegate some of your responsibility to the cloud service provider to help you with that. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand, roles and responsibilities. The next thing is, hey, I showed you this slide already. What are they doing to secure the services that you're running in that cloud? Are they using the hope strategy, right? Or do they actually have some sort of standard that they're writing software to? Because usually people want to talk to me about operations or data center physical security because they have expertise in data center physical security because you operate your own data centers. But have you been writing secure code is the question, because that's where all those vulnerabilities that I talked about, thousands of them, 6,000 to 7,000 of them a year are, not in the data center, okay? Operational security assurance, so people want to talk about operations. That's different from development, different set of folks doing that. So do they have a process that takes inputs from ISSA, ISC squared, ISACA, InfraGard, the best practices from the people and the organizations in this room? Do they take that information and plug it into their process to make their process better? Because that's what we do at Microsoft. We listen to the experts in this room and these organizations, and we take requirements from you on how we should be operating our cloud services. And then we try to be very, very transparent. All right, so one cool thing I wanted to show you is how we're using the cloud to help you with botnets. I keep talking about botnets and exploit kits. So we have a section inside Microsoft called the Digital Crime Unit. They do a bunch of things. One of the things they try to do is take down botnets. Okay? So they take down botnets all over the world, and a lot of people have asked us, hey, can you give us the IP addresses of those botnets? So what you're looking at here is all these dots are different botnets that we've taken down and now report to Microsoft as their command and control server. The longer the spike, the more botnet infections there are there. I pulled this data the other day. We're going to see the botnets around this building in New York City, and you can see that they're everywhere. So a lot of customers have said, we want those IP addresses of those infected systems so that we can see whether the systems inside of our bank are infected with those botnets. But we can't give you those IP addresses because we'd have to give them to everybody, right? I can't give them to one bank and not another bank. I can't give them to one automaker and not another automaker. Very, very hard. We don't want to give them a list of IP addresses that they might not own because it's a privacy issue. So what we're doing is using the cloud. We put the botnet IP addresses into Azure. If you're an Azure Active Directory customer, what that means is when people are logging into your Azure Active Directory-based applications, if their IP addresses that they're logging in from are in those botnets, you'll be able to pull the report showing you that they're in the botnets. Another thing is we found a Russian organized crime syndicate that had a file in their possession when we helped law enforcement take them down that had 1.4 billion usernames and passwords that they had been collecting over a period of years. And I keep having this conversation with customers. Complex password, passphrase, this debate has been going on forever in the industry. But let me ask you, if I can look up your username and password in a file that has 1.4 billion usernames and passwords, does it matter how many uppercase, lowercase characters it has? Whether it has a space, whether it has symbols? No, those days are gone. Passwords are broken. We are buying lists of compromised passwords and usernames from around the world. We are getting them from illicit forums, and we're putting them into the cloud. So if your organization is using Azure Active Directory-based apps, people are logging in, you can go to your Azure reports and see people in your own organization. If their usernames and passwords are showing up on those lists of stolen usernames and passwords, you'll see it right in the list. Now you'll see the usernames and passwords that have been stolen through phishing attacks and so on. So here we have Susie. Her username and password's been stolen, but how does that really help us? Well, we can just right-click on that, and we can do multi-factor authentication very, very quickly. It's 2 clicks, and I can enable multi-factor authentication for Susie. Now, in order for the bad guy to use her credentials, her username and password, they'd also have to have physical access to the phone in her office or her cell phone. So immediately, within 2 clicks, I can enable multi-factor authentication on her account. And even though some guy in Russia has her valid username and password, he's unable to use it because he doesn't have physical access to Susie's second factor, which is the phone in her office, her cell phone, an app, etc. So there's lots and lots of these different capabilities in the cloud. So my point is we're able to do things in cloud at scale because we have identity in the cloud, and I mentioned identity is so important to security. You can't do security if you can't do identity. Because we have identity in the cloud, so many companies, we have 20 million companies, organizations, enterprises in the Microsoft Cloud today. 95% of the world's enterprises use Active Directory. And when you go into the cloud, you're syncing your on-premise Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. That's how we're getting this data, and that's how we're sharing data with you to keep it secure. There's a whole list of things that get enabled in that model, and you can see some of them here on the slide. All right, the list will continue to grow because the one thing about the cloud is innovation, innovation, innovation. All right, so with that, I thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. I'll get John back up here and introduce the next presenter.
So on behalf of the New York Metro Joint Cybersecurity Conference, we'd like to present you with this plaque.
Well, thank you.
For your, this is again a volunteer participation. And it's great to have someone of your stature come talk.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I'd like to bring up Alex